The clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m. when Rosa Martinez pushed her cleaning cart through the empty hallways of Preston University. Her worn sneakers made soft squeaking sounds against the polished floors as she moved from room to room. 8 years she had been doing this same routine, 5 nights a week, cleaning up after people who barely noticed she existed. Rosa was 45 years old, with graying hair that she always kept tied back in a simple ponytail. Her uniform was clean but faded, and her hands showed the roughness that comes from years of hard work. To anyone who saw her during the day, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a quiet cleaning lady who did her job and went home. But Rosa had a secret that would have shocked everyone at the university. She started her shift in the mathematics building, just like always. The hallways were lined with pictures of famous mathematicians and quotes about the beauty of numbers. Rosa knew every face on those walls, could recite most of the quotes from memory. As she dusted the frames, she sometimes whispered the names of these great minds like old friends. "Good evening, Dr. Einstein," she would say softly as she wiped his picture clean. "Dr. Newton, how are you tonight?" The first classroom she entered was Professor Wilson's basic algebra class. Rosa emptied the trash cans and wiped down the desks, but her eyes kept drifting to the whiteboard. Simple equations were scattered across it, problems that first-year students had worked on earlier that day. Rosa could solve them all in her head without even trying. She remembered when math had been this simple for her too, back when she was 7 years old in Colombia. Her father had been amazed when little Rosa could do multiplication tables faster than kids twice her age. By the time she was 12, she was solving problems that made her high school math teacher scratch his head in confusion. Those days felt like a lifetime ago now. Rosa moved to the next classroom, Professor Chen's intermediate calculus course. The problems on this board were more challenging, derivatives and integrals that would make most people nervous. But as Rosa cleaned around the board, her mind automatically worked through each problem. She noticed a small error in one of the solutions, where a student had forgotten to apply the chain rule correctly. For just a moment, Rosa's hand hesitated over her cleaning cloth. She could fix it so easily, but she caught herself and moved on. It wasn't her place. The truth was, Rosa had once been Dr. Rosa Martinez, a mathematics professor at Universidad Nacional in Bogotá. She had published papers on advanced calculus and taught hundreds of students. Her colleagues had respected her. Her students had loved her classes, and she had been on track for a department head position. Then everything changed. The violence in her neighborhood got worse. Her husband Diego was threatened by local gangs who wanted to use his small business to launder money. When he refused, they made it clear that Rosa and their daughter Sophia were no longer safe. They had a choice: cooperate with criminals or leave everything behind. The decision was easy, but living with it was hard. They came to America with 2 suitcases and big dreams. Diego spoke better English than Rosa, so he found work at an auto repair shop. Rosa tried to get her teaching credentials recognized, but the process was complicated and expensive. Her degree needed to be verified, her English needed to be certified, and they needed money to survive while she jumped through all the hoops. Months turned into years. The credential process dragged on with endless paperwork and fees they couldn't afford. Sophia needed school supplies and clothes. The rent needed to be paid. Rosa's English was good enough for daily conversation, but academic English was different. The few teaching positions she applied for went to candidates who sounded more American over the phone. Eventually, Rosa stopped trying. She took the cleaning job at Preston University because it paid the bills and had good health insurance. She told herself it was temporary, just until they got on their feet. But temporary became permanent, and before she knew it, 8 years had passed. Most nights, Rosa could push down the sadness and focus on her family. Diego was doing well at the shop and might soon buy it from his boss. Sophia was now 16 and getting excellent grades. She wanted to study engineering, and Rosa was determined to make sure her daughter had every opportunity she deserved. But some nights, like tonight, the old dreams would creep back in. Rosa entered Professor Davidson's advanced calculus classroom, the one she always saved for last. This was where the real mathematics happened, the kind of problems that most people would find impossible. Differential equations, complex analysis, multivariable calculus. The board was covered with work from that day's lesson on integration by parts. As Rosa cleaned, She found herself studying the problems more carefully than usual. Professor Davidson was brilliant, she knew that. She had heard students talking about how challenging his classes were, how only the smartest students could keep up. Looking at his work, Rosa could see why. His explanations were thorough and his problem selection was excellent. But there, in the third equation, Rosa spotted something that made her pause. It was a small error, the kind that even excellent mathematicians make sometimes. Professor Davidson had set up an integration problem correctly, but in the middle of the solution he had made a sign error. It was subtle, the kind of mistake that would confuse students for days as they tried to understand why their answers didn't match. Rosa stared at the board for a long moment. She could fix it so easily. Just erase one small minus sign and replace it with a plus sign. The students would understand the lesson better, and Professor Davidson would never know he had made a mistake. But what if someone saw her? What if they wondered how a cleaning lady knew advanced calculus? Rosa had worked hard to be invisible here. It was safer that way. She turned away from the board and continued cleaning, but as she dusted the professor's desk, her eyes kept drifting back to that error. It bothered her like a pebble in her shoe. Mathematics was supposed to be perfect, beautiful, true. Leaving an error on the board felt wrong, even if it wasn't her responsibility to fix it. Finally, Rosa couldn't stand it anymore. She looked around to make sure the hallway was empty, then walked back to the whiteboard. With her cleaning cloth, she carefully erased the minus sign. Then she picked up a piece of chalk and wrote a clean plus sign in its place. The equation was now correct. Students would be able to follow the logic without confusion. Professor Davidson would never know there had been a mistake. Rosa stepped back and looked at her correction. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again, not just a cleaning lady, not just someone who emptied trash cans and mopped floors. For just a moment, she was Dr. Rosa Martinez again, a mathematician who cared about getting things right. She put the chalk back exactly where she found it and finished cleaning the room. As she pushed her cart toward the exit, Rosa didn't know that this small act would soon change everything. She was just happy that tomorrow's students would see the correct solution, and that somewhere in the world, mathematics was a little bit more beautiful than it had been an hour ago. Professor Davidson arrived at his classroom 15 minutes early, just like he did every Tuesday and Thursday morning. At 58 years old, he had been teaching mathematics at Preston University for over 20 years, and he still felt excited about each new lesson. Advanced calculus was his favorite subject to teach, partly because only the most dedicated students made it this far. He set his coffee cup on the desk and turned toward the whiteboard to review yesterday's lesson. The integration problems were still there from the previous class, waiting to be erased for today's new material. But as his eyes scanned the equations, something made him stop. The third problem looked different somehow. Professor Davidson stepped closer to the board, adjusting his glasses. He had worked through this particular integration by parts problem dozens of times over the years. He knew it by heart. But the solution on the board was perfect. He distinctly remembered making a small error during yesterday's explanation, but now the equation was completely correct. He stared at the plus sign where he was certain there had been a minus sign the day before. Interesting, he muttered to himself, pulling out his phone to take a picture of the corrected equation. Someone had fixed his mistake, but who? And more importantly, who had the mathematical skill to spot such a subtle error and the confidence to correct a professor's work? Students began filtering into the classroom at 9:25 a.m. Professor Davidson watched each face carefully as they entered, wondering if one of them had stayed late or arrived early to make the correction. His advanced calculus class was small, only 18 students, and he knew them all fairly well. There was Jennifer, a quiet but brilliant mathematics major who rarely spoke in class but always turned in perfect homework. Could it have been her? Then there was Alex, who often stayed after class to ask detailed questions about the material. Maybe Tony, the graduate student who sometimes helped him grade papers? But as Professor Davidson thought about it, none of his students typically had access to the classroom after hours. The building was locked at 8 p.m., and only faculty and staff had keycards for evening access. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Davidson said as the last student took their seat. "Before we start today's lesson, I have a question for you." The students looked up with mild interest. Professor Davidson was known for his engaging teaching style, often starting class with mathematical puzzles or real-world applications. Yesterday, I made a small error in the third integration problem on the board, he continued, pointing to the corrected equation. This morning I found that someone had fixed it. The correction is mathematically sound and demonstrates a clear understanding of integration techniques. A few students turned to look at the board with more interest. Jennifer raised her hand tentatively. Was it wrong yesterday? She asked. I copied it down exactly as you wrote it, and when I tried to work through it at home, I couldn't get the same answer you got. Exactly, Professor Davidson smiled. The error would have been confusing for anyone trying to follow the solution, but someone corrected it overnight. I'm curious, did any of you come back to the classroom after hours? The students looked around at each other, shaking their heads. A few shrugged. Professor Davidson felt his curiosity growing stronger. Kevin Martinez, no relation to Rosa, though they shared a last name, sat in the back row with his arms crossed. Kevin was a third-year business major who was only taking advanced calculus because it was required for his degree. He struggled with the material and often seemed resentful about having to be there. Maybe it was the cleaning lady, Kevin said with a smirk, causing a few students to chuckle. She's probably a secret math genius. The comment was meant as a joke, but something about Kevin's tone rubbed Professor Davidson the wrong way. There was a dismissiveness in his voice that suggested he found the idea of a cleaning person understanding mathematics to be absurd. Actually, Professor Davidson said carefully, that's not as far-fetched as you might think. Some of the brightest mathematical minds in history have come from unexpected backgrounds. Kevin rolled his eyes. Come on, Professor. You really think the cleaning lady knows calculus? She can barely speak English properly. Professor Davidson felt his jaw tighten. He had always prided himself on running an inclusive classroom, and Kevin's comment crossed a line. But before he could respond, another student jumped in. That's pretty rude, Kevin, said Lisa, a sophomore who had always been one of his more thoughtful students. You don't know anything about her background. I know she cleans toilets for a living, Kevin shot back. If she was some kind of genius, don't you think she'd have a better job? The classroom fell uncomfortable silent. Professor Davidson could see that several students were cringing at Kevin's words, while others seemed curious about where this conversation was heading. Kevin, Professor Davidson said firmly, that's enough. You're making assumptions about someone based on very limited information, and frankly, your comments are inappropriate. But Kevin wasn't backing down. In fact, he seemed to be enjoying the attention his controversial statements were getting. I'm just being realistic, Professor. I mean, if you really think she could solve calculus problems, why don't we test it? Next time she comes in to clean, we could ask her to solve something on the board. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jennifer looked horrified at the suggestion, while Alex seemed to be considering it with scientific curiosity. That would be cruel, Lisa said immediately. You're talking about embarrassing someone just to prove a point. I'm not trying to embarrass anyone, Kevin replied, though his grin suggested otherwise. I'm just saying, if Professor Davidson thinks it's possible that she corrected this equation, then let's find out for sure. What's the harm in asking her a simple math question? Professor Davidson realized that the situation was getting out of hand. He had intended to share an interesting mystery with his class, not to create a debate about the cleaning staff's intelligence or worth. But Kevin's suggestion had sparked something in the room, a mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and unfortunately cruel amusement among a few students. The harm, Professor Davidson said slowly, would be in treating another human being as a test subject for our entertainment. Regardless of who corrected this equation, everyone deserves to be treated with respect. But Kevin wasn't finished. Look, I'm not saying we should be mean about it, just friendly. Like, hey, could you help us with this math problem? If she says she can't do it, no big deal. If she can, well, that would be pretty amazing, right? Professor Davidson looked around the classroom and saw that Kevin's suggestion had divided his students. Some looked disgusted by the idea, while others seemed intrigued despite themselves. The worst part was that a few students were actually nodding along, as if they thought Kevin's experiment might be interesting to try. This conversation is over, Professor Davidson said firmly. We're here to learn mathematics, not to devise ways to test the staff. Now let's move on to today's lesson on advanced integration techniques. But even as he began writing new problems on the board, Professor Davidson could hear whispered conversations continuing behind him. Kevin had planted a seed, and despite Professor Davidson's attempts to shut it down, that seed was beginning to grow in some students' minds. As the class progressed, Professor Davidson found himself distracted by thoughts of the mysterious correction and Kevin's cruel suggestion. He wondered who had actually fixed his mistake, and he found himself hoping that whoever it was would never have to face the kind of test that Kevin had proposed. Little did he know that within a week, his hopes would be shattered, and the quiet cleaning lady who had corrected his equation would find herself facing exactly the kind of humiliation that Kevin had suggested. The only question was whether she would rise to meet the challenge or simply walk away from a situation designed to make her fail. A week had passed since Professor Davidson discovered the corrected equation on his whiteboard. He had tried to forget about Kevin's cruel suggestion, but the idea seemed to have taken on a life of its own among some of his students. He caught them whispering before class, noticed the way they glanced toward the door during lessons, as if waiting for something to happen. On this particular Thursday afternoon, Professor Davidson was in the middle of explaining a particularly challenging integration problem when he heard Kevin whisper something to the student next to him. The professor paused his explanation and gave Kevin a warning look, but the young man just shrugged innocently and pretended to focus on the board. The problem Professor Davidson was working through involved multiple steps of integration by parts, combined with substitution techniques. It was the kind of problem that would challenge even his best students, requiring not just knowledge of formulas but a deep understanding of when and how to apply different methods. As you can see, Professor Davidson explained, the key to solving this type of problem is recognizing the pattern and choosing the right approach from the beginning. If you start with the wrong method, you'll find yourself going in circles. Jennifer raised her hand. Professor, what if you realize halfway through that you chose the wrong approach? Do you start over or try to adapt? Excellent question, Professor Davidson replied. Usually it's better to start fresh rather than try to force a method that isn't working. Mathematics rewards patience and clear thinking over stubborn persistence. As he spoke these words, Professor Davidson didn't realize how prophetic they would prove to be in just a few minutes. At 3:47 p.m., exactly 13 minutes before class was scheduled to end, the classroom door opened quietly. Rosa Martinez entered with her cleaning cart, just as she had done hundreds of times before. She usually tried to time her rounds so that she wouldn't disturb classes, but sometimes the schedule didn't work out perfectly. Sorry, Professor, Rosa said softly, her accented English barely audible. I come back later if you need. Professor Davidson started to nod and tell her it was fine to wait, but before he could speak, Kevin's voice cut through the classroom. Actually, could you help us with something? The room went dead silent. Professor Davidson felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening. Several students turned to stare at Kevin in shock, while others looked between him and Rosa with uncomfortable anticipation. Rosa stopped pushing her cart and looked confused. Help? She asked, genuinely not understanding what Kevin wanted. We're working on this calculus problem, Kevin continued, his voice taking on a falsely friendly tone that made Professor Davidson's skin crawl. Professor Davidson thinks someone with your background might be able to help us figure it out. Professor Davidson stepped forward immediately. Kevin, that's not what It's just a simple math question. Kevin interrupted, speaking directly to Rosa now. See this problem on the board? We're having trouble with it. Think you could take a look? Rosa's eyes moved to the whiteboard, where the complex integration problem covered nearly half the space. Her expression remained neutral, but Professor Davidson noticed her grip tighten slightly on the handle of her cleaning cart. I don't think, Professor Davidson began again. But this time it was another student who interrupted him. Come on, let's see what she can do, said Mitchell, one of Kevin's friends who rarely participated in class discussions, but seemed eager to join this particular conversation. Lisa, the student who had defended Rosa the week before, looked mortified. This is terrible, she whispered, but not loudly enough for Rosa to hear. Our Rosa stood in the doorway, clearly sensing that something wasn't right but not fully understanding the situation. She could see that all 18 students were now staring at her, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement, and a few with obvious discomfort. I should go, Rosa said quietly, starting to back toward the door. "Oh, come on," Kevin called out, his voice getting louder. "Don't be shy. It's just math. Either you can do it or you can't, right? No shame in not knowing." The cruelty in his tone was becoming more obvious now. What had started as a harmless test was revealing itself as exactly what Lisa and Professor Davidson had feared, a setup, designed to humiliate someone for the entertainment of a few cruel students. Professor Davidson had heard enough. "Kevin, stop this right now. Rosa, please ignore him. You don't need to." "But Professor," Kevin said with mock innocence, "didn't you say last week that some of the brightest mathematical minds come from unexpected backgrounds? Isn't this a chance to prove that?" Rosa's eyes sharpened slightly at these words. She looked from Kevin to Professor Davidson, beginning to understand that she had somehow become the subject of a debate she hadn't been part of. "What did you say about me?" Rosa asked, her voice still quiet but with a new edge to it. Professor Davidson felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Rosa, I simply mentioned that mathematical ability can be found anywhere. Kevin has taken that comment and twisted it into something I never intended." "So you don't think she can do it?" Mitchell chimed in, grinning at his friend's cleverness. "I think," Professor Davidson said firmly, "that this entire situation is inappropriate and disrespectful." But Rosa was still looking at the board. The complex integration problem stared back at her, its multiple variables and nested functions representing exactly the kind of mathematical challenge that had once excited her every day. She hadn't worked through a problem like this in years, not since she had given up on getting her credentials recognized and accepted that her mathematical career was over. "This problem," Rosa said slowly, "is about integration by parts with substitution." Kevin's eyes lit up with anticipation. Several students leaned forward in their seats. Professor Davidson felt a sense of dread building in his chest. "That's right," Kevin said eagerly. "Think you can solve it?" Rosa was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving across the equation. Professor Davidson could see her mind working, could almost see the wheels turning as she analyzed the problem. He realized with growing certainty that Rosa understood exactly what she was looking at. "Kevin," he said urgently, "this has gone far enough. Rosa, you don't owe anyone a demonstration of anything." But Rosa wasn't listening to him anymore. She was staring at Kevin with an expression that had changed completely from confusion to something much more intense. For 8 years she had been invisible in this place. For 8 years people had looked through her as if she didn't exist. And now finally someone was challenging her to prove herself. The problem was that they expected her to fail. They wanted her to fail. This wasn't a genuine interest in her abilities. It was a setup designed to confirm their assumptions about who she was and what she was capable of. Rosa looked around the room at 18 young faces. Some looked embarrassed by what was happening. Others seemed genuinely curious. But a few, led by Kevin, were watching her with the anticipation of people waiting for a show. She thought about her daughter Sophia, who would graduate high school in 2 years and wanted to study engineering. She thought about all the times she had told Sophia to be proud of who she was, to never let anyone make her feel small or invisible. She thought about the dreams she had given up and the career she had left behind. And then, slowly, Rosa Martinez walked toward the whiteboard. "Okay," she said quietly, her accented voice carrying clearly through the silent classroom. "I look at your problem." Professor Davidson held his breath. Kevin sat forward in his seat with undisguised excitement. And Rosa, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and long-dormant pride, reached for a piece of chalk. Rosa held the piece of chalk in her hand and stared at the whiteboard. The integration problem sprawled across the surface like a mathematical mountain waiting to be climbed. For a moment, the classroom was so quiet that everyone could hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Kevin sat on the edge of his seat, barely containing his excitement. He was certain he was about to witness exactly what he expected. A confused cleaning lady struggling with mathematical concepts far beyond her understanding. He had his phone ready to record what he thought would be an amusing moment to share with friends later. Professor Davidson stood frozen near his desk, unsure whether to intervene or let the situation play out. Part of him was curious despite himself, especially after the mysteriously corrected equation from the previous week. But mostly, he felt sick about what was happening to Rosa. Rosa examined the problem more closely. It was a complex integration by parts problem, combined with trigonometric substitution, the kind of problem that typically took his advanced students 15 to 20 minutes to solve, assuming they knew what they were doing. "This is integral of x times e to the power of x times sine of x," Rosa said slowly, reading the problem aloud. Her accent made some students lean forward to hear her better. "That's right," Kevin said with barely hidden condescension. "Think you can handle it?" Rosa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she continued studying the problem, her eyes moving across each part of the equation. Professor Davidson noticed that her posture had changed. The hesitant, almost apologetic way she usually carried herself was gone. She stood straighter now with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. "This problem," Rosa said finally, "has 3 different ways to solve." Jennifer blinked in surprise. She had been working on problems like this all semester and had never considered that there might be multiple approaches to the same integration. "3 ways?" Professor Davidson asked, his curiosity overcoming his discomfort with the situation. Rosa nodded. "I show you first way, most common method that students learn." She began writing on the board, her handwriting neat and precise. As she worked, she explained each step in her accented but clear English. "First, we use integration by parts. Let u equal x and dv equal e to the x times sine x dx." The students watched in growing amazement as Rosa worked through the problem step by step. Her mathematical notation was perfect. Her logic was clear and, most shocking of all, she was obviously comfortable with concepts that many of them struggled to understand. Kevin's confident smirk began to fade as Rosa continued. This wasn't what he had expected at all. "Now we need integrate e to the x times sine x," Rosa continued. "So we use integration by parts again. Let u equal sine x, dv equal e to the x dx." She worked through the nested integration with the kind of fluid confidence that comes only from deep understanding. When she reached a point where the original integral appeared again on the right side of the equation, she showed how to solve for it algebraically. "And here is first solution," Rosa announced. Stepping back from the board, the classroom was silent. Rosa had not only solved the problem correctly, but she had explained it more clearly than many of the students had ever heard it explained before. That's actually right," Jennifer whispered in amazement. But Rosa wasn't finished. "Now I show you second method using complex exponentials." Professor Davidson's eyebrows shot up. Complex exponentials were graduate-level material, well beyond what he typically covered in his undergraduate courses. Rosa began a new approach, using Euler's formula to convert the trigonometric function into complex exponential form. As she worked, she explained how this method often made integration problems more manageable by eliminating the trigonometric complications. Kevin's mouth hung open. This was definitely not what he had planned. "And third method," Rosa continued without pausing, "is to use contour integration from complex analysis." Now Professor Davidson was staring openly. Contour integration was advanced graduate material. He taught it in his PhD-level courses, and even then, only his best students truly grasped it. Rosa drew a simple diagram on the board showing a contour in the complex plane. "We extend function to complex domain, integrate around closed contour, then use residue theorem." As she worked through this third solution, Professor Davidson realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Rosa wasn't just solving the problem, she was demonstrating a level of mathematical sophistication that surpassed most of his graduate students. "Holy crap," Alex whispered, earning a sharp look from Professor Davidson for the language, but no one could focus on propriety at the moment. When Rosa finished the third solution, she turned to face the class. The transformation was complete. This was no longer the quiet, invisible cleaning lady who emptied their trash cans. This was clearly someone who understood mathematics at a profound level. "All 3 methods give same answer," Rosa said simply. "But third method, it shows you why this integral has the form it has. Mathematics is not just about getting right answer, it's about understanding why answer must be this way." The silence in the room was deafening. 18 students and 1 professor stared at Rosa as if seeing her for the first time. Kevin looked like he had been slapped. His cruel little experiment had backfired spectacularly. Professor Davidson was the first to find his voice. "Rosa," he said carefully, Where did you learn mathematics? Rosa's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment. She glanced around the room, seeing the shocked faces staring back at her. She began, then stopped. For 8 years, she had been careful to keep her background hidden. It was safer that way, easier. But now standing in front of this whiteboard covered with her work, pretending to be someone she wasn't felt impossible. I was professor, Rosa said quietly, in Colombia, Universidad Nacional de Bogotá. I teach calculus and differential equations for 12 years. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth. Lisa looked like she might cry. Even Mitchell, who had been enjoying Kevin's cruel game just minutes before, now looked ashamed of himself. You are a mathematics professor? Professor Davidson asked, his voice filled with wonder and horror as he began to understand what had happened. Rosa nodded. I have PhD in applied mathematics. I publish papers on numerical methods for solving partial differential equations. She gestured toward the board. These problems, they are, how you say, elementary for me. Kevin had turned bright red. The student who had just moments ago been treating Rosa like his personal entertainment was now staring at someone whose mathematical credentials likely exceeded his professor's. But why? Jennifer started to ask, then stopped, realizing the question might be too personal. Rosa seemed to understand what she wanted to know. When we come to America, my credential's not recognized here. Process to get teaching license is very complicated, very expensive. We need money for food, for rent. So I take job that was available. She looked directly at Kevin as she continued. For 8 years I clean these classrooms. I listen to lectures, I see problems on boards. Sometimes I see mistakes and I fix them when no one is looking. Professor Davidson's eyes widened as understanding dawned. The corrected equation last week, that was you? Yes, Rosa said simply. I cannot watch wrong mathematics stay on board. Students need to see correct solution. The weight of what had just happened began to settle on everyone in the room. They had spent the semester being taught by Professor Davidson, while the woman who cleaned their classroom at night had been quietly correcting his mistakes and possessed mathematical knowledge that exceeded anything they had ever encountered. Kevin slumped in his chair, looking like he wanted to disappear. His cruel joke had revealed him to be not just mean-spirited, but also completely ignorant about the person he had chosen to humiliate. Rosa looked around the room one more time, seeing the mix of amazement, shame, and confusion on the students' faces. Then without another word, she carefully placed the chalk back where she had found it and walked toward her cleaning cart. The spell was broken. The invisible cleaning lady was about to disappear again, returning to her world of mops and trash cans. But this time, everyone in that room knew they would never see her the same way again. Rosa was halfway to the door when Professor Davidson's voice stopped her. Rosa, please wait. She turned around slowly, her hand still gripping the handle of her cleaning cart. The confidence she had shown while solving the equations was fading, replaced by the familiar uncertainty of someone who had learned to expect disappointment. I'm sorry about what happened here today, Professor Davidson said, looking directly at her. What Kevin did was wrong and I should have stopped it sooner. Kevin, who had been staring at his desk in shame, finally looked up. I'm sorry too, he said quietly. I thought I was being funny, but I was just being cruel. I had no idea. No, Rosa replied simply. You had no idea because you never asked. You see, cleaning lady, so you think you know everything about me. The truth of her words hit Kevin like a physical blow. He realized that he had spent an entire semester seeing Rosa in the hallways, watching her clean his classroom, and had never once wondered about her life, her background, or her dreams. To him, she had been nothing more than part of the furniture. Professor Davidson stepped closer to Rosa. May I ask you something? Do you still want to teach? Rosa's eyes filled with tears that she tried to blink away. Every day, she whispered. Every day for 8 years I want to teach. But it's too late now. I am 45. My English, it is not perfect. And the process to get credentials, what if it's not too late? Professor Davidson interrupted. What if there was a way? Over the next hour, while the scheduled classes were forgotten, Professor Davidson and Rosa talked. He learned about her publications, her research in numerical methods, and her years of teaching experience in Colombia. Rosa, hesitant at first, gradually opened up about her struggles with the credential recognition process and the barriers she had faced. Meanwhile, The students sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed. Jennifer had tears in her eyes, thinking about all the time she had struggled with calculus concepts while the person who could have helped her most was emptying the trash can beside her desk. Alex pulled out his phone and began researching the credential recognition process for foreign professors. Lisa started looking up the university's policies for hiring faculty with international experience. Even Mitchell, who had laughed at Kevin's cruel joke, was now searching for information about immigration and education. By the end of that day, word had spread throughout the mathematics department. Department head Dr. Richards came to speak with Rosa personally, bringing forms and information about the university's process for hiring international faculty. "We have a pathway for this," Dr. Richards explained to Rosa in his office. "It's not quick and it requires some paperwork, but we can help you get your credentials properly evaluated and recognized. In the meantime, would you be interested in working as a teaching assistant while we sort out the details?" Rosa could barely speak. After 8 years of being invisible, suddenly everyone wanted to help her become visible again. The process wasn't instant or easy. For the next several months, Rosa worked both jobs, cleaning at night and assisting with mathematics classes during the day. She had to take an English proficiency exam, get her transcripts officially translated, and complete additional training on American teaching methods. But the hardest part was learning to see herself as Dr. Rosa Martinez again, instead of just Rosa the cleaning lady. Professor Davidson became her strongest advocate. He helped her navigate the university bureaucracy and introduced her to other faculty members. When Rosa hesitated to speak up in department meetings, he encouraged her to share her ideas. When she doubted her English skills, he reminded her that mathematics is a universal language. The students from that Thursday afternoon became some of Rosa's most dedicated supporters. Jennifer started staying after Rosa's tutorial sessions to ask detailed questions about advanced topics. Alex created a study group that met specifically to work through problems with Rosa's guidance. Most surprisingly, Kevin transformed completely. The shock of discovering his own prejudice had shaken him to his core. He started volunteering for the university's English as a second language program, helping other immigrants practice conversational English. He also became one of Rosa's most devoted students, working extra hard to make up for his previous behavior. 6 months after that dramatic day in the classroom, Rosa received official notification that her credentials had been recognized. The university offered her a position as an assistant professor of mathematics, with the possibility of advancement based on her performance. On her first day as Dr. Martinez, Rosa stood in front of a classroom full of students, not as someone cleaning up after them, but as their teacher. She wore a simple but professional dress, and her hair was styled instead of tied back in the practical ponytail she had worn for 8 years. "Good morning," she said to her introduction to calculus class. "My name is Dr. Rosa Martinez, and I am very excited to be your professor this semester." In the back of the room, Professor Davidson sat quietly observing. He had arranged to audit Rosa's first class, officially to provide feedback for her evaluation, but really because he wanted to witness this moment of triumph. "Before we begin," Rosa continued, "I want you to know that I understand what it is like to feel invisible. To feel like your knowledge or abilities do not matter. Some of you may struggle with mathematics, and some of you may feel like you do not belong in this classroom. I want you to know that everyone belongs here, and everyone has value." She turned to write on the whiteboard, and several students noticed the confident way she held the chalk, the fluid motion of her writing, the natural ease with which she filled the board with equations. "Mathematics," Rosa said as she wrote, "is not about being smart or being perfect. Mathematics is about asking questions, making mistakes, and learning from those mistakes. It is about discovering patterns and beauty in the world around us." During her lunch break that day, Rosa walked through the same hallways where she had pushed her cleaning cart for 8 years. But now, students greeted her as Professor Martinez and stopped to ask questions about homework assignments. Faculty members nodded respectfully and included her in conversations about curriculum and research. At home that evening, Rosa's daughter Sophia was bursting with pride. "Mom, I told everyone at school that my mother is a college professor now. My friends can't believe you were cleaning toilets just last year." Rosa smiled and hugged her daughter. "Mia, I was always a professor. The difference is that now other people can see it too." Kevin, meanwhile, had written a long essay about his experience that day, which he submitted to the university newspaper. The story was picked up by local news outlets and eventually went viral on social media. Thousands of people shared their own stories about times they had made assumptions about others based on appearances or circumstances. The story inspired the university to create a program to help other highly qualified immigrants get their credentials recognized and find positions that matched their abilities. They called it the Rosa Martinez program, though Rosa insisted they should use a less personal name. 3 years later, Dr. Rosa Martinez was promoted to associate professor. She had published new research, received excellent teaching evaluations, and become one of the most beloved faculty members in the mathematics department. But perhaps more importantly, she had proven something that everyone in that classroom had learned the hard way. Brilliance can be found anywhere. Genius can be hidden in the most unexpected places, and every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not for what circumstances have forced them to become. The cleaning cart was long gone, but the lessons it had taught about dignity, respect, and the danger of assumptions would last forever.